Hello and welcome to ASEAN Pacific shows. Today our topic is Indonesia's maritime diplomacy under Joko Widodo. The maritime diplomacy of Indonesia, which is a maritime country consisting of thousands of islands and significant maritime checkpoints, is of a great importance in terms of regional security, regional cooperation, and international maritime trade route, and many similar issues is the geopolitical importance of Indonesia. In this show, in order to better understand the maritime diplomacy of Indonesia, particularly during the President Joko Widodo, I'm going to ask and discuss with my guest who is closely monitoring and studying on Indonesia's maritime diplomacy and special during President Joko Widodo. My guest is Dharma Agastia. Dharma is an assistant professor at International Relations Study Program at President University Indonesia. His research focuses on maritime security and diplomacy in Southeast Asia with a focus on Indonesia. Welcome, Dharma. Thank you for joining me today.
Hi, Lokman. Nice to join the show.
Thank you. Dharma, when we're talking about the maritime diplomacy of Indonesia, what kind of features and importance does Indonesia have in terms of international maritime trade routes and strategic waterway passages? Can you give us a little bit overview about Indonesian maritime diplomacy, please?
Okay, so before we start talking about Indonesian maritime diplomacy, we sort of need to acknowledge the geographical reality of Indonesia. It's often repeated in textbooks that Indonesia is located in this so-called crossroads position, where it is situated between the Indian and the Pacific Ocean, and in between the Asian continent and the Australian continent, and thus making it a very central place for all the where all maritime trade routes, both ancient trade routes from China, India, and in this day and age from China to the Middle East to Europe. So, given this position, we need to understand that Indonesia's approach to maritime diplomacy depends mostly on how does the country sort of maintain this position and not let it be taken over, especially by foreign powers? How does Indonesia assert its independence and capitalizes, if you may, on this crossroads position? So in terms of international trade routes, there's many straits that cross Indonesia, but I think the most important one would be the Malacca Strait, which is by international law, it's international waterway that is they're supposed to be in the jurisdiction of Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. But on top of that, we also have the designated sea lanes. So Indonesia, as an archipelagic state under the Convention on the Law of the Sea, has the right to draw these so-called archipelagic sea lanes, which allows transit throughout the archipelago. So one of those sea lanes is the one that goes to the South China Sea through Natuna, and then south through the Sunda Strait that goes straight into the Indian Ocean. The second one is in the Sulu Sea and going south, cutting north-south through the Lombok Strait. This is usually facilitating trade from the Philippines and Australia. And then we have the other sea lanes that are in the east. So in the Arafura Sea, mostly used for international trade coming from Australia and then northwards bound to Philippines and in Japan, if I'm not mistaken. So I think that sort of gives you an idea of how central Indonesia's location is, and it just gives you an idea of how vast Indonesia's maritime territory is.
And in this aspect, can you please tell us what is the importance of Indonesia for regional maritime security, and in this respect, what kind of developments took place under President Joko Widodo?
Okay, that's actually an interesting question. Joko Widodo was known as this, in his first term, Jokowi advanced this maritime first agenda. He wanted Indonesia to become a global maritime fulcrum. And it was a very ambitious plan on multiple. He set high targets in multiple areas to improve Indonesia's overall position in the maritime domain. So these are in areas such as the economy. You wanted to increase maritime trade coming to the country. There is also diplomatic efforts in this sense, asserting Indonesia's sovereignty in both, and also solving maritime territorial disputes. And there's also a security related aspect, that is the empowering the Indonesian Navy and other relevant maritime law enforcement agencies to be able to better protect Indonesia's both national and international interests. So in this case, the Jokowi presidency is perhaps one of the first presidencies that openly admits that that maritime security, is very important for Indonesia. That being said, however, when it comes to regional maritime security, I think Indonesia doesn't really. How do I put it? We need to understand Indonesia's approach to maritime security as something that is inherently domestic first. Now, what do we mean? What do I mean by that? The thing about the maritime domain in Southeast Asia is that most countries are still, because of the overlapping EEZs granted by UNCLOS, that's the Convention of the Law of the Sea. There's a lot of territorial disputes that occur not just with countries outside of the region, but also with neighbors. So, for example, there's Malaysia and Singapore over the Pedra Branca Islands, Malaysia, Indonesia over various parts, but most famously the Ambalat Block. In Malaysia and the Philippines, Indonesia, the list goes on. And because of this, Indonesia tends to very much prioritize its sovereignty first over overcoming regional maritime issues. Like in 2000 I think I observed that it was around in 2003 or so, when the Malacca Strait was designated as being a high-risk international waterway by the I forgot the name of the company. It's the Lloyd's the Lloyd something. But yeah, it was targeted. It was designated as a very high-risk area, and because of that, insurance premiums basically spiked, causing merchants to sort of avoid. This sort of put the region at risk, because it would be much more expensive than to conduct trades if the insurance premiums were so high. And in 2004, the United States sort of proposed this regional maritime security initiative, which at the time was interpreted by Malaysia and Indonesia, that this would allow the U.S. to deploy military force in the Malacca Strait, and this was accepted really badly in Malaysia and Indonesia. You have Indonesian politicians essentially they essentially cried out, said that this was intervention. This was something that was unacceptable. It's supposed to be our waters, but it's supposed to be our responsibility. But why are these great powers interfering in the region? And this led to the creation of the Malacca Straits Patrol in 2004. Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore banded together to create a coordinated patrol in the Malacca Strait, and this was welcomed very much. Maybe not by outside observers, but rather, but at least within ASEAN, it was one of the first forms of maritime security cooperation that relatively served its purpose. So, but just to dial it back a bit, it just shows you how Indonesia's interest in regional maritime security is very much a domestic first approach. Like if it doesn't really concern us, we're not going to be Indonesia's not going to be too involved in it. It usually takes something as maybe not something as big as a power from outside of the region to sort of kickstart that change. So I think that should cover the importance. Yeah.
From here, I would like to little bit go to the history. How has the Indonesian maritime diplomacy evolved, especially during the after the President Suharto?
Oh, okay. So history, right? Not much can be said about Indonesian maritime strategy under Suharto, other than the fact that it was, again, as I described previously, it was very much domestic first. So, in this sense, the Navy was, in case of operations and strategy, was usually considered well, in the hierarchy of things. You put the Army first, then the Navy, and then the Air Force. So the Navy would generally act in a supportive capacity, rather than as a form of forward defense. And that's generally how it was under Suharto. Much of this was political. I don't think we can like dig too deep into the political side of this. But after Suharto is when things actually started taking off. The Navy was put it was put in a position that allowed it to have a more forward sort of strategy. And I think the document that we need to have or to read to understand this is published in 2004, known as the National Sea Defense Strategy, that is published by the Navy. And in that strategy, in the document, the strategy described is essentially a 3-tiered strategy. It's based on deterrence, this thing called layered defense, and sea control. So if I were to explain it simply, deterrence is, well, prevent aggression from other states, and this is achieved through a show of force, naval diplomacy, and essentially purchasing naval capacity in order to produce this deterrent effect. Then, but if deterrence fails, then we move on to the layered defense strategy. In this case, the Navy would be one of the front lines in preventing an attack from the outside, and working together with the Air Force and other elements to at least prevent the enemies from going on to land. That's the idea. And the last part, sea control, refers more to the day-to-day operations of the Navy. In this case, the control of sea lines, which includes preventing the enemy from being able to use the sea lines, or in this case, just generally speaking, keeping the sea lines safe from terrorists, pirates, whatever threats there are. So I think that's the domestic side. On the international side, there now this is the interesting part in the post-Suharto maritime strategy. It's not really mentioned in the previous documents under Suharto, or that I know of. But in the 2004 strategy, there is a lot of emphasis actually on naval diplomacy. And what do we mean? What does the strategy mean by this? It's port visits, attendance at international exercises or fleet reviews. This is pretty much emphasized in the 2004 strategy. However, it is still rather vague in like saying what are the priorities. I mean, what kind of exercises will we prioritize? It's still rather vague there, but the idea here is that the Navy acts not just on the domestic side as defense, but also forward internationally, not maintaining a presence or projecting power like the U.S. Navy does.
And Dharma, I'm going to ask one question about China. What is the Indonesia's disputes with China over Natuna Sea and the South China Sea?
Okay, this is a contentious topic, and that gets political really, really fast. So the official line of the government is that Indonesia doesn't really have is not non-claimant. Okay, Indonesia is a non-claimant in the South China Sea. That's the official line, and this is despite the fact that the 9 dash line that China draws over the South China Sea overlaps this small portion, this rather wide portion of the North Natuna Sea, which Indonesia asserts that it's theirs. So there's a patch of waters that is northeast of the Natuna Island, and that is where Indonesia's EEZ and China's 9 dash line sort of intersect one another. Indonesia doesn't recognize that as China's doesn't recognize China's claims there, but at the same time, Indonesia doesn't necessarily act as a claimant in the dispute. That being said, however, for the last couple of decades, Indonesia's role has mostly been described as a quote unquote honest broker in mediating the disputes that China does have with ASEAN neighbors. This is evident in the progress of creating this code of conduct in the South China Sea, which up until today still discussions are still stalling. And despite the fact that Indonesia is a non-claimant, the fact of the matter is that these waters north of the Natuna are still very much contested waters, and this has taken a turn. This has basically increased in the last years with illegal Chinese incursions. The Coast Guard, the maritime militia vessels, Chinese fishing vessels, and this kind of dynamic is really not helping. Not helping keeping the peace. And but I doubt that in the future Indonesia will relinquish its non-claimant status. It still seeks to be this honest broker that wants to bridge the differences and essentially be the one to bring an end to this dispute. But we'll see.
Okay, one question will be about Sulu and Celebes Sea. What is the importance of the waterway Sulu and Celebes Sea for Indonesia and its relation with neighboring countries?
Yes, the Sulu and Celebes Sea. Well, it was mostly, for the most part, it was usually considered a part of an ocean that is governed under the jurisdiction of 3 countries: Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. But it was around 2006 when there were some Indonesian nationals who were kidnapped by the Abu Sayyaf group, and it was after this that Indonesia sort of was emboldened to take concrete actions in countering the terrorist threat in the Sulu Sea. For the most part, that's where the Abu Sayyaf group operates, and Indonesia's interest there would be suppressing terrorism. So that's why in 2017, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, they decided to establish the trilateral Sulu Sea patrols, which until today, well, it's really difficult for us to judge the effectiveness of the patrols since they only began a couple of years ago, and it's a bit difficult to establish causation. Are the patrols really the cause of the decline in terrorist attacks, or is it simply just happenstance? But either way, that's the importance of the Sulu and Celebes Sea when it comes in Indonesia's perspective, at least.
And Dharma, Indonesia is expected to become one of the world's largest economy in the coming years. In this respect, what kind of importance will Indonesia's economic maritime diplomacy have for the region and the rest of the world?
I can't say much about exact numbers. Economics isn't really my thing. So when it comes to Indonesia being a large economy, and that is definitely going to grow more in the future. I think the approach that Jokowi is taking specifically is, well, he's always known as this president who prioritizes development, who always prioritizes economic growth. And the maritime aspect of this would be increasing connectivity. So a common complaint of maritime traffic in Indonesia is that they have that Indonesian ports have a very long dwelling time. Dwelling time referring to the time that a ship has to stay at docks, and how long do they have to wait to clear customs and have their cargo offloaded. In Singapore, the average dwelling time, if I'm not mistaken, is around a day or two. It doesn't take that long. And in Indonesia, the ports, because either it's because of a lack of infrastructure or simply because of a long bureaucratic red tape, dwelling time on average is around 2 or 3 days. So it wouldn't make a lot of sense for ships to dock in Indonesia if they wanted to offload their goods, which is kind of a missed opportunity when you think about it. In considering Indonesia's population, it is one of the largest markets in the world, and it's getting even bigger because of the emergence of e-commerce, and there's just and this growing middle class in Indonesia. So what Jokowi is seeking is to, well, create new and better ports, or upgrade existing ports so that they at least can match Singapore. Okay, so that Singapore is going to be the golden standard here when it comes to international seaports. So that's what Jokowi has been investing in for the last since 2017. So in the national, according to the National Planning Agency, there are around 18 seaports that are prioritized in the national development list. So there's essentially a list of high priority projects that the government is seeking to complete, and around 18 of them are seaport upgrades and construction. Now, these ports will also serve the domestic side. So now another problem with the Indonesian economy is that the cost of logistics is very, very high. So I mean, like a common comparison is the price of rice in Papua, which can reach up to 50,000 rupiah per kilogram. That's $5 ish. No, sorry, that's around $3 ish, compared to the price of rice per kilogram in Java, which is often 10 times less than that. And that's mostly because of logistics. So that's what the ports are going to be used for, on the domestic side. But at the same time, they could also be used for some of the ports are designated to be international seaports to handle international import and exports. So that's basically Jokowi's double strategy in terms of increasing Indonesia's maritime diplomacy, economic diplomacy. Sorry.
And in this aspect, when we're talking about the maritime and during Jokowi, what kind of usual joint exercises with bilateral and multilateral partners how Indonesia launched under the Jokowi?
Okay, naval exercises. Well, there's actually a lot to cover, and I think I'm just gonna, if you would allow me to sort of plug in one of my works. My recent paper actually discusses this. It's published in the Journal of ASEAN Studies. It's open access. Essentially, what I do is I observe the trends of maritime cooperation. Most of them involve exercises in ASEAN. But so Indonesia specifically under Jokowi, well, we need to sort of put this into context first. On a bilateral level, at least with ASEAN neighbors and other extra regional, so usually the United States, Indonesia has been conducting naval exercises routinely with ASEAN friends. Just think of Indonesia and Malaysia, Indonesia and Singapore, Indonesia and Brunei. These exercises have been around since as early as the 1970s. So to say that there is a lack of naval exercises in ASEAN is a bit misleading. And even with non-ASEAN members, Indonesia is still engaged in bilateral naval exercises with the United States mostly, and Japan. So the United States, I think we've heard about we know about the CARAT, Cooperation of Float Readiness training, and the CCAT exercises, which is a routine agenda for both for both countries. So in reference to Jokowi, it was in his first term that Indonesia sort of hosted this first multilateral neighbor exercise called the Komodo exercise. It has been held 3 times now. It's held every 2 years. So the first was in 2014. The next one was in 2016, and the last one was in 2018. They say that the largest iteration was in 2018 because that was when 48 countries participated. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe that the 2002 had to be postponed because of COVID. And that's essentially under Jokowi. As far as exercises are concerned, there was the ASEAN naval exercise that was I think it was last conducted in 2018 or I forgot the exact date. And the other one was the ASEAN and China maritime exercise, which happened in 2018, which was a first for the region actually. So because it was the first time that ASEAN as a whole would be engaged with another power outside of ASEAN. Now the interestingly, Jokowi, well, I wouldn't say Jokowi, but the Navy didn't really send its ships as participants in that particular exercise. Well, they did in the tabletop phase, but not in the not at the sea phase. So there's usually maritime exercises are divided into 2 phases: the tabletop phase, where the sailors do simulations of exercises on tabletop, and they have a seagoing phase. That's where the actual drills happen. Now, Indonesia participated in the tabletop phase, but they did not participate in the seagoing phase. They did not send ships as participants, but instead they did send a few observers. So they didn't feel like participating in the actual drills. The same happened in the following year in the ASEAN-US maritime exercise. It was in 2019. And it was the same. Indonesia sent only observers at the seagoing phase, and well, these exercises, because they were new, they didn't really touch upon what I call the high sensitivity operations, and these are sort of like drills that you might conduct with an ally. As if you are preparing for war. So that's not the point of these exercises. What these exercises emphasize was what I call the low sensitivity operations. These are basically sometimes as basic procedures. Okay, basic procedures such as the acronym is VBSS. So I always like lose track of what these acronyms mean. It's something boarding, search, and seizure. If that's what the BSS is, I forgot what the V stands for. But and also practicing this thing called the Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea. It was in 2016 that this code was agreed upon to be implemented by both ASEAN and China, and also the US. And I think these exercises are just a way of socializing the code so that regional navies can understand how they're supposed to implement the code. I think that's what I can say about exercises with under
Yes.
Jokowi.
From Indonesia, I'm going to ask another maritime issue. Recently, there have been very important developments taking place in Indonesia's neighboring country, Australia. And Australia since signed an outstanding nuclear submarines deal with United States and UK, and Indonesia was one of the first countries to react to this agreement. In general, what kind of regional effects do you think in this agreement will have on Indonesia or Indonesia's maritime security?
Okay, so the AUKUS, let's just call it the AUKUS agreement. I've been trying to monitor the AUKUS agreement for the last couple of days, but there's just so much information about the agreement, so I am definitely going to miss some things. But you are correct when you say that Indonesia was one of the first countries to react, and Indonesia's reaction was generally, well, I wouldn't say it. Okay, let's just be honest. Indonesia was sort of disapproving the AUKUS agreement, and this is a sentiment that is, well, not just the official line of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Well, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs used much more hedging language, if I may say so. So they would carefully monitor. They would urge Australia to show constraint and to not let this exacerbate existing tensions. Um, the view among academia, especially the academics that analyze defense, they sort of see this as a potential for a new arms race in Southeast Asia. In this case, nuclear submarines. And it won't do any good. Essentially, just going to increase tensions. It's like Australia gets nuclear submarines, then Indonesia is going to get new submarines. Essentially, the arms race all over. And I understand this from an Indonesian standpoint, why they're so worried, why we are so worried about this. It's because, well, if you take again as referring to our very first, our your first question regarding Indonesia's geography. Indonesia is in that position, like that crossroads position, and it's really easy then for a nuclear submarine, let's say operating from Australia, to sort of silently pass through Indonesia's waters, submarine underwater routes, undetected for most of the time. That's the point of having a submarine, and for it to sustain operations for as long as 2 months in Indonesian waters undetected. And of course, Indonesia is worried about that. And not to mention, this is a region where most of the countries operate submarines to a certain degree, and it's the problem here is that there's very much as the recent tragedy about related to the Indonesian submarine, the KRI 402 Nanggala. Indonesia doesn't have submarine recovery capabilities, and if an accident were to happen, not just to Indonesia, not maybe to an Indonesian submarine, maybe to a partner submarine, it's simply not going to be. We might just see another disaster just brewing. So, generally speaking, Indonesia is, well, the AUKUS agreement is definitely going to ruffle a lot of feathers. It has actually ruffled a lot of feathers, and speaking from an Indonesian perspective, um, I think what will happen most, I think the effects, okay, that you were asking, it's simply going to increase a lot of tension. It's going to exacerbate tension in the region, unless, of course, somehow something is done on a regional scale. Now, Indonesia has been a very vocal advocate of urging constraint, and but it's really not. We're not really sure how we're going to do this. Generally, ASEAN is considered Indonesia's sort of primary line of defense on a regional scale, but we don't really know. So I think the situation is still very much fluid at this point.
Yes, I think that when we're talking about the reaction of general ASEAN countries, I think the ASEAN countries divided over to the
Very much divided.
yes. And, the most important thing how Jakarta read this agreement is very important when we come to the Indonesia's maritime diplomacy and geopolitical location. It is crucial for Indonesia, I think.
Very, very crucial. And I think the people in Jakarta really are like really do have there is a consensus, at least in Jakarta, that this agreement is just going to be it's simply going to increase tensions. It's not going to reduce tensions at all. And at this point, it's definitely up to ASEAN to come up with a counter response to this. But judging the condition of ASEAN for the last couple of years, this is going to be it's going to be difficult. Um, One thing that's for sure is that the AUKUS agreement is generally going to, ASEAN is going to definitely urge the AUKUS countries to sort of abide by the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which envisions a free, inclusive, and a peaceful Indo-Pacific. And yeah, and it's not really sure how ASEAN is planning to sort of act as a bridge between the countries and China, because that we know for a fact that this agreement is a form of balancing against China. And it's when it's this overt, it's a bit difficult to sort of expect ASEAN to, how does ASEAN expect to build a bridge between this, and how would Indonesia, as vocal as it is against the AUKUS agreement, is still very much has a hard time perhaps convincing its neighbors to follow their interests.
Yes, there is also China's factor should be taking account for Indonesia.
Definitely.
And Dharma, when we're talking about the arm race and following this AUKUS agreement or deal, is there any possibility, do you see Indonesia will buy and looking for new recruitment of the submarine?
At this point, I don't think it's in it. There are plans to acquire nuclear powered submarines, but there are plans for conventional submarines. Now there's that would breed another problem though, and that is related to the geography that I mentioned before. You have a region that's full of submarine traffic, and very, very few, if not any, rules of engagement in place. I mean, at this point, I mentioned the queues, or the code for unplanned encounters, previously. The issue is that the queues does not really apply to submarines. No submarines, or even non-military naval vessels. Again, so the potential is just like, all you need is just really, really bad luck, and next thing you know, you have increased regional tensions. But no, I don't think that Indonesia has any plans to acquire nuclear powered submarines at this point.
I just wonder about the political side of this agreement. Just when we're talking about the AUKUS, the situation of France. France removed from the agreement, and now the Australia did this agreement with United States and the UK. Is it possible to, in this respect, Indonesia increase its relationship with France? How do you see in general?
I don't really. I haven't really looked into it, but as far as relations with France is concerned, there haven't been any overt increase in hostilities. I'm going to use that term liberally. There's not an overt increase in hostilities in diplomatic relations between France. So maybe it's just something that the MOFA doesn't really want to disclose, or really there's nothing going on. I'm not sure. It's hopefully it's the latter. Like, nothing really is going on. We're still cool with France, and yeah, it's business as usual. And I don't think at this point Indonesia is going to risk its relationship with France, especially after our defense minister Prabowo finished started this deal on military equipment with France. I forgot what military equipment it was, but when Prabowo just completed his Europe tour of defense shopping, that's when I don't think Indonesia is going to sort of try to jeopardize intentionally its relationship with France just because of this.
Okay, Dharma, thank you very much for provide this amazing information about Indonesia's maritime diplomacy.
My pleasure.
And also thank you very much for the audiences who have been with us until the end of program. Please don't forget to subscribe to channel and in order to get notified about the next shows. Thank you, Dharma, again, and see you in the next program.
See you next time.
Thank you.